in the future, will Bungie have, or maybe put forth a more concentrated effort to bring more of the lore directly into the game for a more cohesive narrative? An example is, I asked before stream if anybody knew the name of the Scion Flayer that was in charge of trying to crash the Almighty into the tower, into Earth, and pretty much nobody knew Amtek's name unless you read the lore. That's one of those things about the game where if you're not constantly staying up to date on all the little pieces, and that's an RPG element that should be respected, but having that stuff put in front of you is very important. Is that going to be something we should expect in the future? Or are we going to continue to have to, even just for main plot points, to have to go to the Grimoire and read?
I think it's a mix, right? Like Aramis is a character I believe that we summoned from the history of the game. And it also depends on, how our lore, which is largely looking into the history, and how the lore, the narrators contained therein, sometimes reliable, sometimes how that relates to what we're doing. We do have a plan and vision for where we are trying to take this story, and we may find the lore super valuable in some respects, and in some respects it might be a zag because narrators maybe aren't always as reliable as we think they are.
What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages? Joker back again, once again, and today we're talking about Bungie's favorite literary device, the Unreliable Narrator. Now, of course, because every video is somebody's first, an unreliable narrator is a narrator whose credibility is compromised by their own bias and how they choose to color and convey information. For example, you might be reading the first-person perspective of a character who was abused by their father as a child. The narrator then might superimpose their own trauma and paranoia on their expectations of others. A harmless look to the narrator might be a look of mockery, of judgment, of hate, of anger, of disgust, when in actuality, the person that they were trying to superimpose their own paranoia and trauma on was doing nothing more than looking at a sign behind our point of view character. But because the point of view character has this trauma and paranoia, it colors the reality of everything we, the reader, are exposed to. Other types of unreliable narration, and the ones that we often see utilized in Destiny, are the lie, like we see in Truth to Power and the Chronicon, propaganda like we see in the Book of Sorrow and the Book of the Unveiling, and again in the Chronicon, and then we have things that characters comment on that they wouldn't have first-hand knowledge of, and in fact runs contrary to already established lore. The most prolific example of this is Warmind versus Warmind. Is there only one Warmind, or were there multiple? In Ghost Fragment Mysteries, Rasputin states, "I bear an old name. It cannot be killed. They were my brothers and sisters, and their names were immortal too. But Titanomachy came, and now those names live on in me alone I think, and think is what I do." In Ghost Fragment Old Russia 3, a card that takes place during the Golden Age, it's stated that Rasputin was the Tacit King, the brooding, weary first among equals. Now, people might say, "But Joker!" Charlemagne and Joyeuse, and I believe Malahayardi were all downgraded in Destiny 2 to submines, and that these were nothing more than fragments of Rasputin. But that really doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, why is Rasputin alone then, when it's entirely within his power to make more submines? After all, they're just fragments of Rasputin. And why does Rasputin need us to activate the last array in Destiny 1 to free his Earth-stranded fragment? There's a lot of things that just don't add up if Rasputin is the only Warmind and everything else was just a fragment of him. Also, by this definition, Fellwinter would have been a submind. Fellwinter isn't referred to as Rasputin's brother or sister or equal, but as Rasputin's son. Some people might then point to Tyra Karn when she states, "I was correct about Charlemagne existing, just not about what it was." If we hadn't done that research, we wouldn't know anything about subminds. However, the very next line states, Raoul still disagrees. And then she goes on a tirade about how Raoul needs to get his head out of his engrams, simply for disagreeing with her. However, if her evidence was unrefutable, why would Master Raoul disagree? If she had proof, that doesn't make sense, calling into question the validity of her evidence and research. We also need to consider the source of the information, something we'll be talking about in more depth later on. Now, while it's funny to make fun of Master Raoul because of Destiny 1 and a design choice, he is the main cryptarch of the Tower and the Consensus. He's also a historian and a linguist. And then you have this ambient piece of dialogue, 755 feet to a side, 36,506 inches, less than a tenth of a degree from true north. Is that location significant? Ha, everything's significant. Given everything we know, and I can't believe I'm defending Master Raoul, he isn't the type of person to just disregard data because he doesn't agree with it. In fact, he's probably the type of person to overanalyze it. By contrast, Tyra Karn is just an archivist and suffered a form of memory loss during the Red War. On top of that, she delves into insulting Master Raoul the second she even thinks about somebody disagreeing with her assessment. And on top of all of that, it's a very real possibility that Rasputin himself tampered with that data. So is Tyra Karn an unreliable narrator, or is this a retcon? Now, Bungie has a huge problem with retcons, and sometimes it's hard to tell if something is a retcon or the product of an unreliable narrator. Mostly because we're never given any reason to believe that any of these found at the foot of the Great Pyramid, narrations. When we look at something like the Book of Sorrow or the Life and Times of Shim-Nal-Fur, we know intrinsically to take those sources with a grain of salt. The Book of Sorrow is ultimately history, his story, Oryx's story to be more precise. And just like you have to with real-world history, you have to take the bias of the source into account when judging the merit and validity of any given history. Herodotus' histories get a lot of crap because it contains historical events right next to mythology, but he's clear at the very beginning that these are stories from where he traveled, and only kind of ordered chronologically, and that was a choice made after he started writing these stories down. Another bias that we can take from the Book of Sorrows is the removal of Nokris. Funny enough, this has an echo in real-world history, and I'm going to pronounce all of these names wrong, but Akhenaten was an Egyptian pharaoh who ruled during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom period of Egypt. He was infamous for, one, moving the ruling city of Egypt from Thebes to the one that he founded, Akhenaten, which would come to be known as Amarna. Then he changed the traditional religion of Egypt from the worship of many gods to the worship of one god. And after his death, basically everything he did was changed right back, and a fairly decent effort was made to erase him from the histories. In fact, Akhenaten was unknown in Egypt history until the discovery of his city in the 19th century. So when we see things like the removal of Nokris from Hive lore, we know that there's been some historical revisionism. However, things get blurry when characters correct the history without the lore necessary to back them up. And we see that with the Warmind versus Warminds example from earlier. Now, we've talked about what an unreliable narrator is, and we've gone over some Destiny-relevant examples, some good ones, some bad ones, but why does it matter? And what does so much unreliable narration do to the lore and the world building and the story of Destiny? While unreliable narration can be a very, very strong tool in fiction that allows the reader or the viewer to get inside the head of any given character, and allows you to understand why the character is framing the narrative the way that they are, through their fears, their tastes, their delusions, their beliefs, to the point that the unreliable narration almost becomes the point of the story. And while this works in something like the Book of Sorrow, because it's telling us something about Oryx as a character, what point is there in lorebook after lorebook after lorebook of nothing more than fanfiction, propaganda, and lies? Not only does the narration become unreliable, but so does the lore and the world building. It all becomes pointless as well. And once it becomes pointless, why should anyone care? This is the problem with the overuse of retcons. It comes off less like correcting narrative cohesion, and more like the writers couldn't be bothered to look up established lore, or didn't like established lore, and wrote what they wanted anyways. This makes the world feel cheap and disposable. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Remember to like this video, but only if you did. Subscribe for more of my content. Feel free to donate to my Patreon if you are feeling particularly generous. But above all else, stay frosty.